Interested physicians see a Class A hospital with every scientific device for the probing of human ills and every modern appliance for the relief of physical pain. Astounded sociologists see an ideal city in miniature where every civic problem has been worked out by the 350 patients who form its citizenry to a satisfactory conclusion. But one whom no number of trees can blind to a forest sees in the beautiful reservation only the longest mile in the world. A mile beginning at the entrance gate and ending in a grass-grown slope just out of sight of the buildings. A mile walked with joy by a man in health in 20 minutes. A mile negotiated haltingly and with much agony by one who bears the burden of leprosy in 20 years. A mile that is only an incident to him who walks it, because he will and not because he must. A mile that is a tragedy to him who walks it, because he must and not because he will. Averaging admissions to the leprosarium every 6th day of the year, someone begins anew that mile's momentous journey. Someone. Keep that softly in mind, for only too often the frenzied fear aroused by the leper blinds the hearers to the simplest and truest definition of the word that was ever given. A leper is a man, husband, father, brother, or son, or a woman, wife, mother, daughter, or sister, who is entitled to more than common consideration because of his or her uncommon affliction. Standing just outside the inviting whitewashed lodge gate, let us note the participants in the entering procession. Men predominate, for to every woman whose feet fate has set along that mile, we count 2 men. Today it is a young man, an ex-soldier, who has served his country well. He has now a harder fight ahead of him, for he battles a treacherous foe who gives no quarter and has never known a conqueror. Next comes a woman, young in years, and with postpartum weakness yet upon her. 6 weeks ago, she and her stalwart Acadian husband, in their home along the bayou in the Teche County of Louisiana, looked happily forward to the coming of their first babe. It was the wife's first meeting with one of the medical fraternity. Carefully, the doctor examined the dark splotches to which the young wife had given no attention. His trained eye knew only too well their significance. So the baby, which was to have brought joy, brought dark despair instead. Another one, a gray-haired man says chokingly as he greets the doctor in charge. Another one means that his third and last son has come to join his 2 brothers who preceded him to the leprosarium. And ever in the ears of those who heard it will sound that father's anguished cry, "Would to God that I had leprosy, that I might stay with my children." It is common for relatives to walk that mile together, brothers and sisters, 6, 7, and even 8 in one family, mother and children, cousins, sometimes closely, sometimes distantly related, but by an enigma which remains a medical mystery, but not a social mercy. Rarely, very, very rarely indeed, do husband and wife go down that way together. Even the dancing feet of little children are found along that mile. A burly policeman conducts thither his little daughter, a child of 7 years. "I am taking you to a new school, girlie," he had beguiled her with as they left their home. The new school sounds fascinating, but as the great gate is about to clang and the father attempts a goodbye kiss, a prophetic terror convulses the little one, and she cries out, "Daddy, I don't like this school. Take me away." And the officer of the law, who a week before had been commended for special valor, is unable to undo the clutch of those tiny fingers. Ah, how often it is that little one's prayer repeated by her fellow travelers. Heavenly Father, this school is hard indeed, and I cannot bear it. Take me away. Yes, take me away, though it be no further than to the grass-grown slope at the end of the mile. It is something of a temptation to insert more excerpts of Sister Catherine's writing during these years, but Sister Catherine's life was a long one. To do it justice, one would have to accept a 3-volume study. But this would be unwieldy, and perhaps the aim of this book would not be achieved, which is best expressed in what might have been the subtitle of this work, How Sister Catherine Became a Saint. To do that, one must dwell on human relationships rather than on special achievements. One day at noon recreation, the sound of the bell announcing someone in the parlor wants a tour reached the community room where the sisters were assembled for a half-hour's relaxation. Any volunteer? Asked Sister Edith, knowing that it was a long, tiring walk. The sisters all looked at Sister Catherine, one of them remarking, "You're the one with the gift of gab." Sister Catherine smiled, knowing well that this was a dodge they used often to escape the chore. "Be sure to put in a plug for our chapel," one sister teasingly called after her. Who knows? In the parlor, Sister Catherine found a rather dusty, travel-weary priest and greeted him cordially. "I've always been intrigued with this place, sister, but I've never been able until today to see it for myself. Will you show me round and tell me about, well, just everything?" Sister Catherine smiled with interest. "It's a cook's tour," she warned as they started out. "Tell me when you're tired." They covered the patient's quarters, and Father's outgoing, easy way of meeting people charmed the patients that gathered around him, and one of them said, "You haven't told us Father's name, Sister Catherine." Sister's face flushed a little. "I'm sorry, but I honestly don't know it." The guest interrupted, "Oh, just call me Father. Shakespeare says, 'What's in a name anyhow?'" As they walked back to the convent part of the colony, Father pointed to a parcel of land roped off with a sign that said, "Site of Future Catholic Chapel." He paused with a quickening sense of interest. "Tell me about this, Sister Catherine." Speaking of this at a much later period, Sister Catherine said, "I never put my gift of gab to better use." When she had finished telling him about the chapel, he asked her what she was doing about raising funds for this project. As they were in Sister Catherine's little homemade publicity office, she handed him several leaflets in which she described the need for a Catholic chapel. "Say," he said, "I can help you. I not only can, but I will. I can do 3 things right away. First, I can give you money now and can help you find a way to raise more. Second, I can get you invitations all over the states to talk on your favorite subject, Hansen's disease, and how much these Catholic patients need a chapel, a place of solace of their own." He hesitated just a moment. "And thirdly, I offer you a forum in Church Extension Magazine for spreading the good news of better days to come." Sister Catherine could only gasp, "Why, you're Bishop McGinnis of Church Extension." In later years, in relating this encounter, she would say, "Dear sisters, Providence walks abroad each day of the year. Always remember that when you are tempted to go to the parlor reluctantly, our Lord himself might be waiting there for you. Look what happened to me." In God's good time, as Sister Catherine was wont to say, the chapel was built, a perfect gem of simplicity and quiet beauty. But to whomsoever much is given, of him much will be required. Success has a way of demanding sometimes colossal compensation. Sister Catherine was no exception, either to the human rule or to its supernatural counterpart. There was to be in Sister Catherine's life another dark night. Although Sister Catherine was wont to say throughout her community life that God had never asked her to bear any cross big enough to label suffering. Well, we all have different names for our woes, but most of us know by reflection and actual experience how true Thoreau's dictum is when he said, "All men lead lives of quiet desperation." But to tell it like it is, we must go back a little in the history of our community to one sister who had exercised much influence on Sister Catherine, who in turn practically underwent an amazing change in personality and character under Sister Catherine's influence. But at the time of which we write, neither had been acquainted with the other, except by hearsay. Sister Martha Lawler was a most unusual person, and dare we say it aloud, unusual persons are not exactly favorites, either in the outside world or in religious communities, especially if God in his own secret designs gave them great intellectual powers. America reserves her applause for doers of the deed, the activists who are more known for their hard work than for their powers of clear thinking. Rarely are intellectuals endowed with both qualities, a love of the things of the mind and a love of purposeful action. But Sister Martha was one of these rare exceptions. She had her RN at the time she entered the community and was highly respected as a most unusually gifted nurse. Sister Martha's intellectual preoccupation was centered on her profession, nursing newest and best procedures in all aspects of medicine and patient care. Now, all this is admirable, but in each hospital where Sister Martha worked, it was rumored that she was a medical doctor. This rumor started when interns, residents, and older doctors would say of her in passing, "Best doctor on the staff, best man we've got in surgery and research." It has been said that the medical profession has the highest record for professional jealousy. One wonders what research has been made on the subject, or what high-class opinion polls have been taken to prove this statement. It was all the more remarkable that Sister Martha should be professionally a controversial figure, because she was a withdrawn sort of person, not a good mixer, except in the case of doctors of experience who had reached the top and were no longer threatened with competition. But top men of the medical profession had a way of seeking her out at various hospital conventions and meetings, where she was quite vocal. They would ask her opinion, listen to her theories with respect, and often, when in the city where she was on mission, would visit with her to their mutual benefit. But let us be honest in admitting what we all know. It is not easy, whether lay or religious, to have a prima donna, a broadly acknowledged prima donna, not to say a genius, working in close contact with you every day. Perhaps this is not an admirable trait of human nature, but then let us not miss the fact, no one ever does, that the genius is not always an easy person to live with, and often, without her being fully aware of it, brings upon herself, by her manner, her lifestyle, her method of work, suspicion and distrust. The first, though hardly the worst, is the accusation that the prima donna seeks the limelight for herself alone, not for the community to whom she gave her life to serve, nor for God, to whom she dedicated all her powers and capabilities to prove her love. No, she is a seeker after popularity, aggressive in her search for fame. Anyone who knew Sister Martha and had a spark of perception would never accuse her of showing off or seeking applause. But to St. Paul's statement that there are not many who are noble, we can add with even more truth, there are not many who are perceptive. nor are there many who can reject unsupported prejudice. So in the life of Sister Martha Lawler, rumor begot rumors, and legends blew up to enormous size. Perhaps an example of my contact with her will help to explain. It was in August of 1920. We were returning from St. Louis to our missions in Louisiana after our annual retreat. Sister Martha sat beside me on the smoky train that was carrying us home. I felt quite honored to have Sister Martha in the seat beside me. We talked all day. I was eager to know her, to become a friend of hers. I was 21 at the time, and Sister must have been about 45, but we felt no generation gap. To me, she exuded a sincere but inoffensive humility. There was nothing of Uriah Heep about her, just a genuine humility encompassed within a framework of simplicity. I was fascinated with her, more so with her spiritual outlook than even with her sort of shy sense of humor that I found delightful. She gave me an opening that in the back of my mind I had been waiting for. We had been talking about ourselves, sharing little confidences that sometimes come easier with a comparative stranger than with a friend. I had just confided to her that I was going to make my first holy vows in November of that year, and how I felt about it. She had remarked that she herself seemed to have no lasting dwelling place, since she seldom lasted more than a few years on her many missions, which included even in Panama. "Oh," I said with the wisdom so peculiar to the young, "don't you think that's because you're the kind of person around whom legends grow?" And really, as the word implies, not always true. She smiled a little thoughtfully. Legends are not always lies either. There is usually a grain of truth, isn't there? I hesitated for a moment. Then I said, "Sister Martha, there are only 2 of these legends about you that interest me, and I think they're lies. Would you think me terribly rude to ask you about them?" She turned toward me with a gleam of interest in her eye. "Tell me," she said. "Well, sister," I replied, "there are only 2 legends which really intrigue me, and I want to ask you if they are true. The first is that once you had to have an operation for appendicitis, and you refused to take an anesthetic because you wanted to stay awake and direct the entire operation. So in spite of what must have been excruciating pain, you directed your surgery in every detail. Is that true?" "Yes, it is true," she said with almost a sad smile. "I did not have full confidence in the surgeon, and when I asked his permission, he said, 'Yes, you'll be a source of confidence to me.' But, sister, I'm not proud of that episode. I was young," she said reminiscently, "and rash." I looked at her with admiration. "Were you clobbered for it?" She smiled ruefully. "Yes, I was clobbered. I deserved it because it was unethical for a nurse to attempt to tell a doctor what to do. And anyhow, very few of them listen anyway." While I was digesting this, she asked with ill-concealed amusement, "What is the second rumor? You see, one was really true." "Well, the next legend," I said, burning with interest, "is that once you were assisting a surgeon who was operating on a woman, and you thought he was needlessly removing some healthy tissue. You gasped in horror and said, 'Doctor, don't go in there.' He threw the scalpel down and said, 'Well, Sister Martha,' almost beside himself with anger, 'you finished the job,' and hurried out of the room. There was no time to lose, so you picked up the instruments and went right on with the operation, finished sewing the woman up. Then you, too, left the operating room almost exhausted. But the top man in surgery congratulated you that same afternoon." Sister smiled at me. "You're right about this rumor, too. I should not have said a word during the operation or at any other time. But I don't feel so sorry about this as I do about the other. This time, my conscience and sense of justice were affronted. I'm glad I interrupted what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. Still," she added judicially, "I had again failed seriously. in the ethics of my profession. I loved Sister Martha from that moment until she died some 16 years later. This saga of Sister Martha from that moment until she died will perhaps seem irrelevant to some readers, but she figures so dramatically in the life of Sister Catherine's second night that it seems important for the reader to get a telling insight into the kind of person she was. Life at Carville was flourishing under the federal government, which in the way of finances left nothing undone for brightening the life, as far as one can, for those afflicted with Hansen's disease. Sister Catherine was far ahead of these anti-intellectual times. She sent Sister Hilary Ross to nearby Louisiana State University to earn a degree in chemistry. Sister Hilary was a born scientist. She was placed in charge of the laboratory and gave her time to research, studying blood changes, symptoms of increase or decrease in the health of the patients where the condition of the blood played an important role. Sister Hilary collaborated on various vital articles with the various doctors who were interested in research, and these articles, published in learned journals of medicine, particularly the National Journal of Leprosy, not only made the United States Public Health Hospital at Carville, the only one in the United States, internationally known, but helped doctors to diagnose and treat the disease in its early stages. Dr. Denny was extremely well pleased with the work the sister nurses were doing, pleased too with his medical and clerical staff, and all was right with the world. The sisters, unfettered before with many regulations, directives, and guidelines, now felt somewhat restricted. But, trained well in obedience in the community, they saw that the federal government made prompt obedience a way of life. They often marveled at the respectful obedience the under-officers gave their chief medical officer. It was as if they too had vowed obedience, one sister said. Early in 1921, or perhaps it was the fall of that year, Sister Martha Lawler was added to the sister staff at Carville. Never in my life, she used to say later, did I receive so warm a welcome as I did at Carville. And nowhere in the community could Sister Martha make better use of her talents. Perhaps, too, she never had so faithful and loving a friend as she found in Sister Catherine, who was to have a profound influence on her character and personality. Dr. Denny was not slow to see that he had a fine talent squad in his hospital, but Sister Martha was the bright and shining star of the nursing staff. Though not a Catholic, he respected the sisters highly, but he never lost sight of the fact that he was the commanding officer. Until this time, early in the spring of 1923, this was no problem, but the sister servant at that time was missioned, and in keeping with military protocol, Dr. Denny was the first to be told of the change. His reaction was that the appointment of her successor must be cleared through him. In almost peremptory use of his office, he wrote to St. Louis, "I want Sister Martha to be appointed Chief of Nursing Staff." To the community in St. Louis, this posed a problem, because in those days the chief nurse had to be, as a policy of the community, the sister servant. Sister Eugenia wrote this to Dr. Denny and said that Sister Martha's talents lay in the professional field and not as a community superior. But she promised to send a very competent sister servant who was also one of the best nurses in the community. She explained that she did not like divided authority in a house, and that the policy of the community, remember this was almost 50 years ago, was that the sister servant be chief nurse. Sister Eugenia promised to send a sister eminently qualified for both duties. Of course, this was fuel to an already very hot flame. Dr. Denny sent off another of his fiery letters, saying something to the effect that he was the commanding officer and he alone would select the chief nurse. As for the naming of a superior, the sister who is chief nurse will act in that capacity as in the past. This was completely contrary to the policy of the community. It was unheard of that anyone but the provincial council would select a sister servant. Dr. Denny was so advised, and in 2 days a new sister servant presented herself with her credentials. Sister Catherine was torn between an almost scrupulous loyalty to superiors and the recognition that under the new administration only Sister Martha could handle this big governmental job with the professional know-how that it required. But the new sister servant was already in the community room, and she had to welcome her. In her heart she felt a great foreboding, but when she saw who the new sister servant was, she all but fainted. It was none other than her beloved sister, Stella Lacey.
Dr. Denny, in time, became one of the best friends the community had. But he was young at this period, and it was his first time in a leadership position. His reaction, it seemed cold at the time, was to treat Sister Stella as a guest of the sisters. This meant he saw no reason to interview her or to show any other sign of acceptance. To this day, guests of the personnel, including the sisters' visitors, pay their own room and board for the duration of their stay. So this was no particular slight aimed at Sister Stella, but she felt it to be a great humiliation at the time. The sisters all suffered at this major squall, but none more so than Sister Catherine and Sister Martha. They knew the rules of the game and understood Dr. Denny's position, but both of them felt he could deal more gently, both with Sister Stella and with superiors in St. Louis. He had spoken. He would not retreat or retract any of his pronouncements. Even so, his conscience must have bothered him. He did not like to hurt the feelings of the sisters. He knew that Carville was remarkable for the union of hearts and minds with no petty jealousies, and always the patient's needs came first. What if the commanding officer in St. Louis should withdraw the sisters? He probably mentioned this fear to Sister Martha. Of course, this is all a matter of conjecture, but if he spoke to Sister Martha, she would be quick to tell him that the commanding officer in St. Louis would be within her rights if she did. At any rate, getting back to visible facts, he sent another letter to St. Louis. He offered this compromise. He said that the office of chief dietitian was at the same level of command and prestige as that of chief nurse. The duty consisted of hiring and firing kitchen personnel, filling the office of purchasing agent, keeping accounts, making out records, and sending them to Washington, evaluating food expenditures and the services of the various personnel, recommending promotions, etc. It was an exacting position, and the under-officer who was filling the position was unsatisfactory. In Dr. Denny's opinion, this would be a better job for combining with the duty of sister servant, and he suggested that Sister Catherine would be acceptable. Sister Catherine knew nothing of this. If she had, her sleep would be more troubled than it had been for the last 2 months, because she would recognize that the commanding officer of Carville was again mixing in the affairs of the commanding officer in St. Louis. Meanwhile, the morale of the sisters was greatly lowered. Sister Catherine had no way of knowing how she stood with her long-loved friend, Sister Stella Lacey. Sister Stella could hardly be blamed if she felt that Sister Catherine and Sister Martha could have eased the situation, because they both had such influence with Dr. Denny. But Sister Stella had never worked in a government hospital. In due time, Sister Catherine received a letter from Sister Eugenia, telling her of Dr. Denny's suggestion. Although it was a kind letter, it too seemed to convey a little doubt and suspicion of collusion, for Sister Eugenia asked Sister Catherine if she thought anyone had been influencing her. She answered Sister Eugenia's letter promptly, pointing out how much further Sister Stella would be hurt by this appointment, that she herself had no qualifications for being sister servant. She asked to be spared this last straw to the threatened peace and harmony of the mission, and said that she herself was about to collapse. On August 12, 1923, Sister Catherine Sullivan was named Sister Servant of the United States Public Health Hospital at Carville. Sister Stella Lacey was withdrawn, and Sister Catherine did collapse. Anyone who has never had a crise de nerfs will never be quite able to understand the suffering entailed, nor the physical shock that follows in its wake. Shattered nerves render the body incapable of normal activity, for one can neither sleep nor eat, and the all-enveloping weakness that results makes it impossible to walk or to engage in normal activities. Of course, people react in various ways according to their own character and personality. With Sister Catherine, it was an all-encompassing apathy. Her mind was perfectly clear, but she could take no interest in what was going on about her. She wept a great deal at this time, and tears were unusual with her. She asked a sister to write to Sister Eugenia and say that she was incapable of being a good sister servant, and would she withdraw her from a situation that had become intolerable. Whatever the sister wrote, we shall never know, but a letter came by return mail from Sister Eugenia addressed to Sister Catherine. It said in part, "I know that you are suffering, dear sister, and you must not think that Sister Stella Lacey in any way holds you responsible. I know that this has affected you, but time has a way of healing wounds like these. What is of much greater concern to me is the state of your health. You have been under a great strain for many months, and perhaps some of it still lingers. Therefore, I want you to take bed rest until I feel you are able to be up and around again. When I say bed rest, I don't mean an afternoon nap. I want you to stay in bed. And remember, it will take a long time. The chaplain will be glad to bring you Holy Communion each morning. I shall send a carbon copy of this letter to Dr. Denny in the same mail as this." Naturally, this letter was a source of solace to Sister Catherine, but it worked no miracle for her health. She was very, very ill. One day, Dr. Denny came to visit her shortly after Sister Eugenia's letter. He said, "Say, I like that Sister Superior of yours. She's a great woman, and I admire her very much. You must get well for her sake as well as mine. By the way, before I came over from the office, I looked in your files to see how much time off you've had. I find that for 7 years, you've only had 2 weeks off for your annual retreats. That's a mere decimal point. You know what? Counting your no sick leaves and only half vacations, you have a backlog of 93 days. Isn't that fine?" The sisters at Carville are paid according to their rank in office. The higher the office, the higher the salary, with every day's absence docked. Poor Dr. Denny thought that it would cheer Sister Catherine to know that her illness would be without loss of pay. But at that time, nothing could cheer Sister Catherine except her spiritual life. But time, good nursing care, and an understanding doctor, all acting under the watchful eye of divine providence, brought Sister first out of her depression, then out of her weakness, and finally to robust health again. But as Sister Eugenia had warned her, remember, it will take a long time. It is a custom of the community that in November or December 8th at the latest, each sister servant send in the annual report of her mission. the sisters, their duties, and her own stewardship. On November 28, 1923, Sister Catherine wrote her first report as Sister Servant of Carville. A brief excerpt gives insight into the depths of her humility. To the perceptive, the telltale evidence of deep suffering on the part of Sister Catherine, who could never bear anything that struck at the peace and harmony of the house in which she dwelt. Excerpt from the annual report from Carville, dated November 28, 1923, and signed by Sister Catherine Sullivan. The loyalty to superiors and devotion to this work shown by the sisters of this mission during the trying times of the past year lead me to hope that our Lord will reward their obedience by the appointment of a sister servant who can recompense them for their submission to the circumstances that placed me in this duty. With this ever present to me, I most humbly resign the duty of sister servant and trust that my dear companions may reap in time, as they certainly will in eternity, the reward of their patience and fidelity. Sister Eugenia must have been sincerely touched at this letter. Of course, she did not relieve Sister Catherine of the office of sister servant. Not until 1936 did Sister Catherine leave Carville, and then it was to take up the office of Assistant Visitatrix. Chapter 6. To one's amazement, Sister Catherine turned out to be a simply wonderful sister servant. There was perhaps a touch of over-orthodoxy in regard to the keeping of the rules and customs of the community, but to any who objected, she would point to the medical staff and their scrupulous adherence to any rules laid down, and there were many, by the government, many of which looked like red tape for the sake of red tape. And she would point up the instant obedience of the subordinate officers to any suggestion of the commanding officer. The sisters would get the point. They had all had enough of the persistence of the CO of Carville. Sister Laura Stricker, who is still serving in Carville, sends these notes about Sister Catherine as sister servant. Notes on Sister Catherine Sullivan by Sister Laura. It was in February 1925 that I first met Sister Catherine Sullivan when I was missioned to Carville, Louisiana, where the United States government has its national leprosarium. Though only 4.5 years vocation, this was my third mission, and I thought I was a complete failure, and thus I came to Carville with misgivings. I was under the impression that one had to be very special to work in a government hospital. When Sister Eugenia, then visitatrix, asked if I had any fear about coming to Carville, I answered, "No, my only fear is that I will not measure up to the requirements of the government." Sister Catherine had a keen insight into human nature, and she must have sensed my fears, for she did everything to make me feel at home. It did not take me long to realize that Sister Catherine was a woman of perfect charity and justice. She possessed an ingenious way of making friends with those who seemed discouraged or misunderstood. I had the privilege of being prepared for my first holy vows by Sister Catherine. Sister could not tolerate failings against charity or even a critical remark about anyone, and severely reproved any uncharitable remarks. In 1925, the morning rising was at 4 o'clock, and I simply could not keep my eyes open at meditation. She insisted I make the effort to keep awake by standing up a number of times, and if I was still sleepy, to leave the chapel and wash my face in an effort to waken myself. She advised me to prepare for the meditation the evening previous and to write down a thought on which I could meditate the following morning. She would follow up my efforts and wait for me after breakfast to ascertain if I had taken a resolution and an ejaculatory prayer to be said frequently during the day. If I failed to do so, she required me to return to the chapel, read the meditation, and report to her. Many times, seeing that I could not get a thought to apply to myself, she would suggest a resolution and an ejaculatory prayer. Sister was far ahead of her times in the matter of education. There were several of the sisters at Carville who had not completed their high school education, so she engaged the most competent teachers from our St. Vincent Institute, a select school for young ladies, just 14 miles from Carville and across the Mississippi River. They came every weekend, and we were in class all day. Then they came for the entire summer, and we had classes all day long. Other sisters who had finished their high school took laboratory courses in physiotherapy and occupational therapy. Sister Teresa Kelly and I studied pharmacy, and after taking and passing our state boards, received our certificates authorizing us to practice pharmacy in the state of Louisiana. Sister also sent me to Louisiana State for my bachelor in music, so that I could become social director for the patients. We had a very active department: drama, play acting, chorale, and all the trimmings. Once, when Sister heard they were offering a course at LSU in Catholic church music, she sent me to take the course so that the patients could sing Gregorian masses, as well as the kind of operatic masses from Mozart, Rosenbaum, etc., so popular in that day. Sister also tried to bring higher education to the patients. She would impart the best professors from LSU and elsewhere to lecture on every subject under the sun. Sister was responsible for the building of the beautiful Sacred Heart Chapel of Romanesque architecture, with its beautiful liturgical marble altar and mahogany reredos and life-size crucifix. To this end, Sister wrote articles for the Catholic Church Extension magazine, and most of the funds were donated by the Extension Society. While Sister Catherine was in Carville, she did not confine her apostolate to this area, but carried on correspondence with young girls who were attracted to the works at Carville and thus brought vocations to our community. Thus, the work of her last years in community of being the director of the Daughters of Charity Information Service had its beginnings in Carville. Sister Catherine gave me a great surprise one year when I was named to make the Indianapolis retreat. Unknown to me, she had written to my parents and to my two sisters, who are Sisters of Providence, inviting them to Indianapolis and providing them with financial aid to do so in order that we might have a family reunion. I had not seen my sisters since they entered their community. What a surprise when I came out of retreat and found my family there. Sister never mistrusted one and never believed another's report, but waited to hear the story from the other one in question. I trusted her implicitly and told her my faults, even though I knew she would be stern with me, but I remembered that she would also be understanding. Sister always frowned on a statement prefixed by the words, "It's too bad that so-and-so." She regarded every event as God's will. When we would say, "It's a blessing she died," referring to a suffering patient, Sister would say, "Don't say that when I die." Though Sister was strict about regularity at spiritual exercises, she advised many times, if a patient wants to talk to you in order to get his troubles aired, stay and let the patient talk, even if you are late. But if it became a habit, she required regularity. Sister Catherine meant so much to me in my early years of imprudence and helped me over many a temptation to discouragement. Sister Laura has summarized magnificently some of Sister Catherine's best and most appreciated qualities. These were qualities that affected the entire community in light of future events when Sister would hold the two highest offices in the province, those of Province Superior and Assistant Visitatrix. Everyone appreciated her remarkable sense of justice. She froze at the introductory words to a juicy bit of gossip. "They say," she would interrupt with, "Who's they, sister? Anybody we know?" As Sister Laura says, she would never listen to one side of a story about another. In her frequent advices to the sisters later, both as assistant and as visitatrix, she would speak of detraction as if it were some kind of reptile, and she would urge upon us this principle: although an angel be the accuser, sisters, I implore you, refuse to believe the story. Nobody but God himself can know the heart of the accused. Judge not, and you yourself will not be judged. Meantime, back at Carville, Sister Martha was proving to be a providential choice for chief nurse. Her duty forced her to be more outgoing. She taught the sister nurses new techniques, and at long last she allowed herself to love. Sister Catherine's example could not fail to impress her. Her lovableness was irresistible. The laboratory work being done by Sister Hilary Ross fascinated her, and a common bond grew between them to the point where Sister Hilary nicknamed Sister Martha Brother, and Sister Martha responded in turn, so that all sisters had an example of brotherly love before them. No one could ever, in her wildest imagination, conceive of Sister Martha as a big sister, but brother was credible. This gives us insight into the unity and harmony that reigned in the house, which is what the daughters call their convents everywhere. Dr. Denny, as the years wore on, was proud as a peacock of his star-studded staff and did not find it necessary to lean upon his office as commanding officer. He gave wide authority for the time out that was necessary for crossing the river to Baton Rouge several times a week, and was proud of the sisters' intellectual achievement. Speaking of intellectual achievement, it was hard to come by, for in those times, 1923, the community was sending only school sisters on for higher studies, because there in the school field was where the pressure was. Speaking of these times, Sister Catherine once said, "I was very anxious to send any of the sisters who had finished high school to Louisiana State University." At this, in my mind, meant an ongoing thing. I asked Sister Visitatrix for a general permission. I painted in roseate terms how ease of access over the river and through the woods the university would be, and Dr. Denny had approved wholeheartedly because he predicted that it will be no time at all before nurses will be required to earn the bachelor degree in their field. So Dr. Denny thinks this is great foresight on our part. Sister Eugenia must have acted immediately, without consulting her counselors. She wired, "Permission granted." Taking no chances with fate's antic ways, and with a sense of foreboding, Sister hurried to act on the permission. She drove to the university and registered Sister Hilary for courses leading to a Bachelor of Science with a major in chemistry. Awaiting Sister Catherine's return to Carville from Baton Rouge was a telegram. It read, "Disregard permission granted. Letter follows. Sister Eugenia." Sister Catherine lost no time in getting to a typewriter. She would have to get a letter to St. Louis before any letter followed. She wrote that she had accepted Sister at her word and registered Sister Hilary promptly, as time was short. She had also paid tuition in advance. How could she now cancel planes? It was sure to begin a round of correspondence with Dr. Denny. Sister Eugenia telegraphed her approval, and thus Sister Hilary Ross became a famed pathologist with international prestige. She was asked to read papers in various countries at international conventions. An interesting sidelight on Sister Hilary and the influence of attending international conventions, how far a little candle throws its beam, is that after her retirement from Carville, when she was really past the age limit, she volunteered for a foreign mission. And, this sounds incredible, she was assigned to Japan. She works in a dispensary there, and as we see her on her visits to St. Louis and to her relatives, we all say that she is incurably Japanese. Meanwhile, Sister Catherine always had a backlog of invitations to speak in all parts of the country. Hansen's disease could be a morbid theme for an entertaining talk. Women's clubs wanted to learn all they could about this. At that time, it was a fairly unknown disease and saw its fascinating possibilities for small talk across bridge tables. For the more serious-minded, it became a bond of interest toward which various charitable activities might be directed. Sister Catherine was a perceptive psychologist. She suited her talks to her audience. But even when she was speaking to the medical profession, she knew how to insert little asides and amusing anecdotes. If this biography were to fail in showing both humor and pathos as facets of Sister Catherine's personality, it would have failed, at least partially, in its purpose to present Sister Catherine as she was. Of the many anecdotes that might be recorded, space allows for only a few. Once she was speaking to a large audience of Vincentian priests and seminarians. It was July 19, Feast of St. Vincent de Paul. As dietitian, I was running back and forth between kitchen and the sisters' refectory, both of which were separate from the patient's culinary department. Naturally, I wanted a special menu to celebrate the event for the sisters as well as the patients. This called for a conference with our chef. "Jason," I said, "do you know St. Vincent de Paul?" "Yes'm, sister, I knows him." "Well, we are having a big feast all day today in his honor. You know he really got the Daughters of Charity organized to do good works all over the world. And just think of this, Jason. He has 46,000 daughters. Jason shook his head in stark disbelief. "That ain't the same St. Vincent I knows. We got a statue to him up in our church. He's a priest. He ain't got no children." There was real pathos to some of her anecdotes, which left not one dry eye in the audience. At Christmas, benefactors were very generous with the patients, but it was rather difficult to surprise them with anything. They had every material comfort that humanitarianism could provide. But this year, a well-known businessman had contributed a check, allowing each a special choice present, one that he could choose for himself. I took charge of visiting each patient to ask what, out of the whole world, he would choose for himself. The ceiling was $5 per patient. As I went the rounds, I came to the room of a dear little old woman with snow-white hair. She was blind, had lost her sense of smell, and all sensation of touch. Only the sense of hearing remained. I sat down for my Christmas visit with her. Taking her hand in mine, though I knew she could feel nothing, I said, "Annie, suppose you could have anything on earth for a Christmas present this year, just anything. What would you choose?" It must have been on her mind, for not taking time to think, she said ever so gently, "Sister, I have no relatives left. I have no one but you. But if you gave me a choice for a Christmas present, I would ask for a flowering plant." "Really?" I asked, almost stunned at the request. "You won't be able to see it, you know. You won't be able to smell it, and you won't be able to touch it. Would you really like that better than a pretty shawl?" "Sister, I know that I won't be able to see it except for my imagination. I know that I can't feel or smell it except by make-believe. But, sister, when the other patients come to visit on Christmas morning, like so many do, I can hear them say, 'Oh, what a beautiful plant. Where did you get such a lovely thing?' And I can smile and say with pride, 'A friend sent it.'" The following anecdote was told with tears in her own eyes. When she told it, however, she always modestly substituted the words "Daughters of Charity" for Sister Catherine, which, however, is the true version. I became very interested in a well-educated man to whom leprosy came like a bolt from the blue. He was a very successful business executive, happily married with several children, of whom he was inordinately proud. Like all patients, he entered under an assumed name. His malady was far advanced before the right diagnosis was made. I don't know what arrangements he made with his wife to shield his children from ever knowing the truth about his illness, but one heartbreaking pledge he asked of her was to forget him and never attempt to see him, nor to come to his funeral. My special interest in him was that he professed to be an atheist. I was determined, with the help of God, to make a Christian of him. I spent a half hour and sometimes longer with him each day. We would discuss current events, books, foreign affairs, and sports. I read widely on these topics so as to be ready for our far-ranging conversations. We became very friendly, and the sister in charge of the pavilion where he was located told me that he would watch the clock, and if I were a bit late, he would ask, "Isn't Sister Catherine coming today?" But I always came. He had made it plain from the first that he wanted no discussion of religion. Finally, he became so ravaged with the disease that he had to be moved to what we would call today an intensive care unit. The day before he died, weak but very alert, he said to me, "Sister, how can a woman of your amazing intelligence wear the same dress every day and work like a slave in this place? Something is behind it. What is the motivation?" "Love," I answered quickly. "You mean a humanitarian love for the needy?" he asked. "No," I said, "love of a person." "Whom?" he insisted. "God," I said. "There's no such person, and I cannot understand a woman with your brains believing that." I left him shortly because I could see that he was becoming weaker, and our conversation bothered him. "Come again," he said as I was leaving. In the early morning hours of the next day, I was summoned to him at his request. I hurriedly dressed and within a few moments was kneeling by his bed. I took his fingerless hand in both of mine, and as I did so, he whispered hoarsely, "Sister, if only I could give you something for all you have done for me. What would please you? Tell me quickly before I die." "Frank," I said, "just 4 little words from you. Just say, 'I believe in God.' That will make me exquisitely happy." I held my breath for his answer. 2 tears slid down his cheeks from beneath his eyelids. As I pressed his poor hand in hope and in strangled prayer, for I was fighting for a soul, he opened his eyes and looked directly into mine. In a weak voice that was trying urgently to be strong, he said his last words on earth, "I believe in Sister Catherine."